Abandoned by fate, yet standing tall in rags, Marcus shuffled through the palace gates, mistaken identity granting him passage to a world of luxury forgotten. His weathered face, once youthful in military fatigues, now confronted Dominic across the gleaming banquet hall. Homeless beggar walks into royal palace wasn't just headlines. It was the collision of worlds, separated by 20 years of misunderstanding. Look into his eyes. They still burn with a father's undying hope. Marcus pulled his tattered coat tighter against the biting Parisian winter, his fingers numb from hours of holding out his empty cup on the Champs-Élysées. The grand palace loomed before him, its golden lights spilling onto the cobblestone street, a stark contrast to the darkness that had consumed his life these past 20 years. He had not planned to enter such a place, but when the security guard nodded at him, mistaking his vintage military coat beneath his layers for formal attire, Marcus couldn't resist the chance for warmth, even if just for a moment. Perhaps it was fate, or perhaps it was merely the confusion of a guard, distracted by the dozens of dignitaries arriving for the state dinner. But suddenly, Marcus found himself swept into the current of well-dressed guests flowing through the ornate doorway. The opulence inside struck him like a physical blow, memories flooding back of a time before the streets became his home, before his search consumed every waking moment. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls from the ceiling, casting prismatic light across marble floors that reflected the faces of the elite like mirrors to another world. Marcus kept his head down, shuffling along the periphery, his heart pounding against his ribs as he waited for someone to challenge his presence, to demand an explanation for why a man with dirt under his fingernails and holes in his shoes dared to breathe the same air as ministers and moguls. Yet no one looked at him, the invisibility he had cultivated on the streets serving him well even here, in this palace of observation. The grand ballroom opened before him, a sea of black ties and evening gowns, of champagne flutes and polite laughter that seemed to rise and fall like waves against the shore of his consciousness. Marcus moved toward a buffet table, his stomach clenching painfully at the sight of food artfully arranged on silver platters, more sustenance than he had seen in months of scavenging and relying on the mercy of soup kitchens. He reached for a small pastry, his hand trembling slightly, wondering if this moment of indulgence would be worth the inevitable humiliation when someone finally noticed him and had him thrown back to the streets where they believed he belonged. A string quartet played in the corner, the music swelling and filling the room with a melody that transported Marcus back to the military academy, to evenings spent studying alongside Dominic, their dreams and ambitions spilling into the night as they planned futures filled with purpose and honor. Those memories had sustained him through countless cold nights, through the devastation of losing his daughter, through the systematic dismantling of everything he had once been. Now, with a belly aching from hunger and a soul aching from loss, he allowed himself this brief respite, this fleeting connection to a world he had once been destined to inhabit before tragedy rewrote his story. He didn't see the man approaching until it was too late, until the crowd parted like a curtain and revealed a face Marcus would have recognized even after 100 years. Dominic stood before him, older now, distinguished with silver at his temples and success in the cut of his custom suit, but with the same piercing eyes that had once seen through Marcus's every facade. Time seemed to stop as their gazes met across the polished floor, recognition dawning like a slow sunrise across Dominic's features, disbelief giving way to shock, giving way to something Marcus hadn't seen directed at him in decades. Genuine emotion untempered by pity or disgust, just raw, unfiltered human connection. Marcus! The name fell from Dominic's lips like a prayer, barely audible above the hum of conversation and music. but to Marcus it might as well have been a shout echoing off the palace walls. The pastry slipped from his fingers, forgotten, as 20 years collapsed into a singularity of emotion too complex to name. The moment of truth had arrived unexpectedly in this place of pretense, and Marcus found himself unable to run, unable to hide behind the persona of the homeless beggar he had become. Instead, he stood his ground, straightened his shoulders in a ghost of military bearing, and spoke the first words to his friend in 2 decades. "Hello, Dominic. It's been a long time." Dominic's glass of champagne trembled in his hand, amber liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim as his eyes remained fixed on the apparition before him. Marcus, his former roommate, confidant, brother-in-arms, stood amid Paris's elite, looking like he had crawled from the wreckage of their shared past. The scar that traced Marcus's jawline was new, as was the silver threading through his unkempt beard, but beneath the grime and years of hardship, Dominic recognized the eyes that had once burned with the same ambitious fire as his own. Those eyes now held something different, a quiet determination mixed with resignation, the look of a man who had been fighting the same battle for so long he'd forgotten any other way to exist. "You're alive," Dominic whispered, setting his glass down on a passing waiter's tray, without looking away from Marcus, afraid that if he blinked, this ghost might vanish back into whatever purgatory had claimed him for 20 years. The military had declared Marcus killed in action during their final deployment, a helicopter crash in hostile territory with no survivors and no bodies recovered. Dominic had mourned, had spoken at a funeral with an empty casket, had carried the weight of that loss through his meteoric rise in the business world, using the memory of his friend's sacrifice to fuel his own relentless drive towards success. And now, here Marcus stood, not a heroic casualty of war, but a man broken by circumstances Dominic couldn't begin to imagine. Around them, the state dinner continued uninterrupted. The elite of Paris society, oblivious to the collision of worlds occurring in their midst, the string quartet transitioning seamlessly from Vivaldi to Debussy, while waiters circulated with flutes of champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvre. Dominic became aware of the stares beginning to turn their way, curious glances at first, then lingering looks of distaste as the guests registered Marcus's appearance, his presence an oil stain on their pristine gathering. Without hesitation, Dominic removed his jacket and placed it around Marcus's shoulders, a gesture of both protection and defiance against the judgment of those who couldn't possibly understand what stood before them. Not a vagrant, but a warrior who had somehow survived when everyone, including Dominic, had abandoned hope. "Come with me," Dominic said, his hand finding Marcus's elbow, guiding him toward a private antechamber off the main ballroom, a quiet refuge where the weight of 20 years might find space to settle between them. The room was small but elegant, with velvet chairs and a crackling fireplace that cast dancing shadows across wood-paneled walls, hung with portraits of stern-faced men from another century. Dominic closed the door behind them, muffling the sounds of the celebration continuing without them, creating a pocket of stillness in which truth might finally surface after decades submerged in silence and assumption. He turned to face his friend, his mind racing with questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered, fears he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge until this moment of reckoning. Marcus lowered himself into a chair by the fire, his body betraying years of sleeping on concrete and park benches, of subsisting on whatever the streets of Paris would yield to a man with nothing but determination to sustain him. The borrowed jacket hung from his frame, emphasizing how much his once powerful physique had diminished, yet there remained something undefeated in the way he held Dominic's gaze, something that spoke of a strength transcending physical prowess. He didn't speak immediately, allowing Dominic the time to reconcile the Marcus of memory with the Marcus of reality, The space between them, heavy with unasked questions and untold stories that spanned a chasm wider than the 20 years that had separated them. "They told me you died," Dominic finally said, his voice catching on the last word. The old grief rising unexpectedly to constrict his throat, despite the living proof before him that it had been misplaced. He remained standing, unable to settle his body or his thoughts, the CEO instincts that had served him so well in boardrooms failing him now in this intimate confrontation with a past he had carefully packaged and placed on a mental shelf labeled resolved. And there was nothing resolved about the man sitting before him, nothing concluded about the story he had believed ended in fire and twisted metal on foreign soil. Instead, here was a new narrative unfolding, one that threatened to unravel everything Dominic had come to believe about loyalty, about success, about the nature of the life he had built upon the foundation of his friend's supposed sacrifice. "I nearly did," Marcus replied, his voice rough from disuse or perhaps from years of shouting into the void for someone, anyone, to help him find what he had lost. He leaned forward, firelight highlighting the hollows beneath his cheekbones, the deep lines etched around eyes that had seen too much suffering to remain young. But death would have been easier than what came after, Dominic. Death would have been a mercy compared to losing her, compared to searching for 20 years without finding a trace of my daughter, my flesh and blood taken from me while I still lay unconscious in a hospital with no name and no memory of who I was. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows that seemed to dance with the ghosts of their shared past, as Marcus's words hung heavy between them. Dominic sank slowly into the chair opposite his friend, the weight of revelation pressing him down with more force than gravity itself. A daughter, an illegitimate child, Marcus had never mentioned during their years at the academy. A secret kept even from his closest friend. The realization that he had known only pieces of Marcus, fragments of the whole man, struck Dominic with unexpected force. How many other crucial details had he missed while focused on his own ambitions, his own trajectory toward the power he now wielded with such confidence in boardrooms across Europe? "Start from the beginning," Dominic said, his voice softer than it had been in years, the commanding tone he used with subordinates and competitors alike replaced by something approaching humility. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands clasped as if in prayer. Though Dominic had abandoned faith long ago, when it failed to provide answers for why good men like Marcus died, while men like himself, ambitious, sometimes ruthless in pursuit of success, thrived in a world that rewarded sharp elbows and sharper instincts. Now, confronted with the living proof that his understanding of justice had been built on false premises, he found himself grasping for some framework to make sense of the narrative unfolding before him, some explanation that would ease the growing ache of guilt forming beneath his breastbone. Marcus's eyes drifted to the fire, seeing not the dancing flames, but the fractured timeline of his own undoing. "Before our last deployment, I met someone. Elise. It wasn't supposed to be anything serious, just a brief connection before we shipped out. I didn't know she was pregnant when I left." His voice caught, the pain still fresh despite the intervening decades. A wound that had never properly healed, but merely scabbed over temporarily before being torn open again and again by each false lead, each moment of hope, followed by crushing disappointment. The crash happened. I survived, barely. 3 months in a coma in a local hospital with no identification. No way for anyone to know who I was, not even myself when I finally woke. By the time I remembered, by the time I found my way back to Paris, Elise had died in childbirth, and my daughter had vanished into the system. The revelation landed like a physical blow, and Dominic found himself reaching for words adequate to the magnitude of his friend's loss. coming up empty-handed in the face of tragedy so complete it defied conventional expressions of sympathy. Outside the antechamber, the state dinner continued, the soft murmur of privileged conversation and tinkling crystal creating a surreal backdrop to the raw emotion contained within their private sanctuary. Dominic thought of his own children, safely ensconced in private schools and summer homes, their futures secured by his relentless accumulation of wealth and influence. He had given them everything except perhaps his time, his authentic presence. Marcus had given his unknown daughter nothing because he had nothing to give, and yet he had devoted 20 years to searching for her, a testament to a kind of love Dominic wasn't sure he understood. "I've looked everywhere," Marcus continued, his gaze returning to Dominic, clear and direct, despite the moisture gathering at the corners of his eyes. "Orphanages, adoption records, foster care systems. I've exhausted every official channel, every legal avenue. I've lived on these streets because this is where Elise lived, where our daughter was born. I've survived by believing that one day I would turn a corner and see her face, her mother's eyes, perhaps my smile, and I would know. I would finally know that all of this wasn't for nothing." He gestured vaguely at himself, at the evidence of his destitution, the physical manifestation of his single-minded quest that had consumed any possibility of rebuilding a normal life from the wreckage of what might have been. Dominic's mind raced, calculating possibilities, connections, resources that could be brought to bear on this problem. It was what he did best: identify obstacles and systematically dismantle them, apply pressure at strategic points until systems yielded the desired outcomes. His network spanned governments and industries. His influence opened doors that remained firmly closed to men like Marcus had become. The irony wasn't lost on him, that all his power and wealth might now serve a purpose more meaningful than acquiring additional power and wealth, that the skills he had honed in service to his own ambition might be redirected toward filling the void left in his friend's life by his absence. "What's her name?" he asked, already reaching for his phone, ready to set in motion whatever machinery might be necessary to reunite father and daughter. "Marie," Marcus said, the name emerging with reverence, as though speaking a prayer or invoking something sacred. "Her name is Marie Devereaux. She would be 19 now." He watched Dominic warily, decades of disappointment having taught him to guard against hope, to expect nothing from a world that had taken everything and offered little in return. Yet despite himself, despite the armor of cynicism he had constructed to survive each day of his search, a flicker of something long dormant kindled in his chest. Dominic had always been the one who made impossible things happen, who bent reality through sheer force of will and strategic brilliance. If anyone could help him find Marie after all this time, perhaps it was the man he had once known better than himself. The friend whose life had diverged so dramatically from his own, yet who now sat across from him, determination hardening his features into something approaching the young officer Marcus remembered from what felt like several lifetimes ago. "We're going to find her, Marcus," Dominic said, the simple declaration carrying the weight of a vow. The first step toward atonement for years, spent building an empire, while his friend searched the streets for something infinitely more precious than market share or profit margins. "I promise you, we will find your daughter." As the words left his lips, Dominic realized that for the first time in years, he had made a promise not calculated for strategic advantage or carefully hedged against potential failure, but born from the purest conviction that some wrongs could be righted, some losses restored, even after hope had been abandoned by all except the most faithful or the most desperate, and perhaps Marcus had been both. Dawn broke over Paris, painting the ancient city in hues of gold and amber as Dominic's limousine glided through streets still empty except for early market vendors setting up their stalls and the occasional street cleaner washing away the evidence of the previous night's revelry. Inside the vehicle's hushed interior, Marcus sat uncomfortably on soft leather. Clean-shaven and dressed in clothes Dominic had sent an assistant to procure at first light, simple but well-made garments that fit his diminished frame with dignity if not perfection. The transformation was incomplete. 20 years of hardship couldn't be erased by soap and fresh clothing, but the man who had entered the palace as a beggar now at least looked like someone who might be listened to, taken seriously when he spoke of a daughter lost to the labyrinthine complexities of French bureaucracy and the passage of unforgiving time. Dominic watched his friend from the corner of his eye while pretending to focus on the tablet in his hands, where he had compiled every scrap of information Marcus had provided into a dossier now being distributed to a team of investigators, data analysts, and legal experts assembled overnight from across his corporate empire. No expense would be spared, no resource left unutilized in this search that had suddenly become as important to Dominic as any corporate acquisition or market expansion. Perhaps more important, if he were honest with himself, a rare state for a man accustomed to the strategic deployment of partial truths and calculated omissions. This mission offered something his business conquests never had: the chance to restore rather than acquire, to heal rather than triumph, to make whole something broken by circumstance and neglect. The official records show no Marie Devereaux matching the timeline, Dominic said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between them as the car navigated toward the first in a series of meetings he had arranged with contacts in government offices normally inaccessible without months of persistence or significant financial persuasion. But that doesn't mean anything definitive. Paperwork gets lost, names get changed, clerical errors occur, especially in cases involving orphaned infants. He didn't mention the other possibilities, that the child had not survived, that she had been taken out of the country, that she had fallen through cracks in systems designed to protect the vulnerable, but often failing those without advocates. There would be time enough for those darker considerations if the initial investigations yielded nothing. For now, Dominic chose to focus on the methodology of the search rather than its potential outcomes. Marcus nodded, his gaze fixed on the passing cityscape. Streets he had walked in desperation for decades now viewed from behind tinted windows that separated him from that former existence as surely as if it belonged to another lifetime. "I've tried all the official channels," he said, an edge of defensiveness in his tone, as though anticipating criticism for having failed to find his daughter despite years of searching. "Birth records, adoption agencies, school registrations. I've gone to them all as much as they would allow a man like me. But without money, without connections." He trailed off, the limitations of his position needing no further elaboration in the presence of a man who possessed in abundance precisely what Marcus had lacked: the currency of influence that opened doors, expedited processes, circumvented obstacles that proved insurmountable to those existing on society's margins. The limousine pulled to a stop before an imposing building that housed one of the ministry offices responsible for child welfare and adoption services. Its neoclassical facade projecting an aura of bureaucratic immutability that had likely daunted many who sought answers within its walls. Dominic's driver opened the door, and the two men emerged onto the sidewalk, an unlikely pair connected by a shared past and now a shared purpose that transcended the vast differences in their current circumstances. "Today we start fresh," Dominic said, placing a hand briefly on Marcus's shoulder, feeling the tension there. The tightly coiled readiness of a man who had learned to expect disappointment but couldn't stop himself from hoping nonetheless. Not as a CEO and a... He stopped, unwilling to name Marcus's condition, to define him by his homelessness rather than by the strength of character that had sustained him through unimaginable adversity. A beggar, Marcus finished for him, the word spoken without shame or self-pity, a simple acknowledgement of the reality he had lived. It's what I've been, Dominic, what I chose to be when the search became everything. I could have rebuilt some semblance of a life, I suppose, found work, an apartment, rejoined society in some fashion, but every job meant hours not searching. Every franc spent on rent meant one less resource devoted to finding Marie. I couldn't divide my focus, not when she was out there somewhere, perhaps wondering why her father had abandoned her, perhaps not even knowing she was someone's missing piece. His voice remained steady, but the cost of his single-minded devotion was evident in every line of his weathered face, every premature grey hair, every moment of dignity sacrificed on the altar of his quest. Dominic had no response adequate to the magnitude of his friend's sacrifice, no words that wouldn't sound hollow or patronizing from a man whose own choices had led to wealth and comfort rather than deprivation. Instead, he simply nodded, a gesture of understanding, if not agreement, and led the way into the building where the first of many officials awaited them, unaware that the meeting about to take place would be unlike any they had experienced before. A confrontation between bureaucratic procedure and the combined forces of a father's undying love and a powerful man's determination to right a wrong that had festered for 2 decades in the shadows of his own success. As they passed through the ornate entrance, Dominic made a silent vow that this time the systems that had failed Marcus would yield different results, that the machinery of government and society would bend to serve justice rather than convenience, compassion rather than protocol. The café on Rue Saint-Honoré bustled with afternoon patrons, conversations flowing as freely as the coffee and wine that fueled them, creating a backdrop of ambient noise that provided a strange comfort to Marcus as he sat rigid in his chair, eyes fixed on the door. 3 weeks had passed since his unexpected reunion with Dominic, 3 weeks of relentless investigation, of doors previously closed, now flung open by the force of Dominic's influence, of hope carefully contained lest it grow too large and shatter him when inevitably dashed against the rocks of disappointment that had defined his existence for 20 years. Yet this lead felt different, more substantial than the countless false starts and dead ends he had encountered during his solitary search. The paper trail Dominic's team had uncovered led to a young art student at École des Beaux-Arts, adopted at 18 months by a professor of literature and his wife after a brief stay in a provincial orphanage following her biological mother's death. Dominic checked his watch for the 3rd time in as many minutes, uncharacteristically nervous, his usual boardroom composure abandoned in the face of stakes far more personal than any corporate negotiation. "She'll come," he said, trying to project confidence he didn't entirely feel, aware that the message they had sent, carefully worded, deliberately vague about the true purpose of the meeting, might easily be dismissed by a young woman with no reason to believe her life was about to fundamentally change. "The DNA test was conclusive, Marcus. She's your daughter. After all this time, you found her." He didn't add that it had taken his resources to accomplish in 3 weeks what Marcus couldn't achieve in 20 years. The truth hung unspoken between them, a reminder of the inequities that separated their worlds, even as they sat at the same table, waiting for the arrival of the one person who connected them across that divide. Marcus didn't respond, his throat too tight for words, as emotions he had kept carefully controlled now threatened to overwhelm him. He had imagined this moment countless times during long nights, huddled in doorways or beneath bridges, had constructed elaborate fantasies of recognition and reunion that sustained him when reality offered little nourishment for body or soul. Now that the moment had potentially arrived, he found himself terrified, uncertain of what right he had to disrupt the life of a young woman who had grown up without him, who might resent rather than welcome the sudden appearance of a biological father with nothing to offer but 20 years of absence and the love of a stranger. He smoothed the front of his new shirt, another gift from Dominic along with the suit that still felt like a costume, an attempt to present himself as something more than the homeless beggar he had been when they reconnected at the palace. The cafe door opened, admitting a sliver of late-afternoon sunlight and the silhouette of a young woman who paused at the threshold, scanning the room with the slight hesitation of someone meeting unknown persons. Marcus's breath caught in his chest, his heart hammering against his ribs with such force he feared it might fail him at this crucial moment. Even at a distance, even without confirmation, he knew. Some primal recognition activating in his cells, some essence of her mother and himself, combined in this person now moving tentatively between tables, her gaze finding Dominic first because he had been the one to arrange the meeting. Her expression curious but guarded as she approached their table with the grace of youth and the caution of someone raised to be polite but wary of strangers with unclear intentions. "Monsieur Dominic?" she inquired, her voice melodic and clear above the ambient chatter of the cafe, her attention still focused on the more obviously prosperous of the two men. "I received your message. I must admit I'm curious what the CEO of Devro Enterprises would want to discuss with an art student." There was a hint of her mother in the slight tilt of her head, the questioning arch of an eyebrow, but the eyes, those were undeniably his own, the same shade of hazel that had stared back at him from mirrors before he stopped looking at his reflection, stopped caring about the gradual dissolution of his former self as the search consumed everything except the essential core of his being that refused to surrender, refused to abandon the child he had never known but had loved with a fierceness that defied rational explanation. Dominic stood, offering his hand with a warmth rarely displayed in his professional interactions, genuine emotion bleeding through the polished veneer of the businessman. "Thank you for coming, Marie. Please, join us." He gestured to the empty chair at their table, positioned so that Marcus would not be immediately facing her, a strategic choice to ease into the revelations that would forever alter the foundations of her understanding of herself. "This is my friend, Marcus Laurent. He's been searching for you for a very long time." As Marie took her seat, confusion evident in the furrow of her brow, Dominic continued with gentle directness. "We have some information about your birth parents, information that may be surprising, but that we believe you have every right to know if you wish to hear it." Marie's gaze shifted to Marcus then, truly seeing him for the first time. Her expression a complex mixture of curiosity and apprehension as she studied the face of a man who appeared simultaneously familiar and unknown. Something flickered in her eyes, a ghost of recognition perhaps, or simply the natural human tendency to search for patterns, connections, explanations when confronted with the unexpected. She placed her hands flat on the table, steadying herself against whatever revelations awaited, and nodded once, decisively. "I've always known I was adopted," she said, her voice softer now but no less clear. "My parents never hid that from me. They told me my birth mother died, and that no one knew who my father was." She paused, the implication of Marcus's presence suddenly registering fully. "But that's not true, is it? You're not just someone with information, you're your father," Marcus finished, his voice breaking on the words he had waited 2 decades to speak to the daughter he had never stopped seeking. The enormity of the moment expanded between them. Time seeming to slow as past and present converged in this cafe, where strangers who shared blood looked upon each other with the wonder of new discovery overlaid with ancient connection. Tears gathered in Marcus's eyes, unashamed, the emotion of 20 years of searching distilled into this single point of contact across a cafe table in Paris, where a beggar who had walked into a palace now sat across from the princess he had never stopped believing he would one day find. "I never knew about you until after I was injured, after your mother was already gone. But once I knew, I never stopped looking. Not for a single day." Marie sat motionless, absorbing the impact of words that rewrote her history, that offered a new narrative to replace the one she had constructed to explain her origins. She studied Marcus's face with an artist's attention to detail, perhaps seeing the echoes of her own features reflected back at her, the same high cheekbones, the same determined set of the jaw. Dominic watched them both, witness to a reunion he had helped orchestrate, but which now unfolded according to its own emotional logic, beyond his ability to control or direct. This was not a business transaction or a strategic alliance, but something far more fundamental, the reconnection of souls separated by circumstance but never truly severed from each other, the fulfillment of a promise made by a father to an infant he had never held but had carried in his heart through years of hardship and hopelessness. "I have questions," Marie said finally, her voice steady despite the tears now tracing silent paths down her cheeks, matching those on Marcus's weathered face. "So many questions." She reached across the table tentatively, her hand hovering for a moment before settling on Marcus's, the first physical contact between father and daughter, a bridge across 20 years of separation, a beginning rather than an end to a story that had consumed one life and was now poised to transform another. In that touch, in the simple human connection of skin against skin, lay the possibility of healing, of reconciliation not just between two people, but within each of them, the chance for Marcus to reclaim parts of himself sacrificed to his singular quest, and for Marie to incorporate this new knowledge into her understanding of who she was and where she had come from. As their hands met, Dominic turned away briefly, overcome by the raw emotion of the moment, by the realization that sometimes the true measure of wealth had nothing to do with money or power, but with the capacity to facilitate such moments of profound human connection, to help restore what had been lost.